so with you.
If you all get to your seats so we can get started with our adult forum. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Lee Egger, who's going to start the festivities this morning.
I'm going to introduce you to the bishop. He comes to us with a multivariate background, very rich background in both pastoral care and academics. And he has so many accomplishments that we're going to spread them out over the 5 weeks of the Lenten series. But for today, I don't want to use up too much of his time. But here's some things that really impressed me. Was predominantly his work with the people in South Dakota. He was named the leading eagle by the tribes there from the Episcopal Church. And he said it was one of the most profound experiences that he'd ever had in his whole life, as well as spiritually. So welcome, Bishop Craig.
Lee, I want to thank you for this, all of this wonderful publicity. I walked in and I saw the table there and all of these icons. And it's good to be with you. And I want to thank the Adult Education Committee. Ted, where are you? Right here, and your leadership in that, and all the members. We had a wonderful time last night gathering at Ted's home and had a chance to get to know one another, to drink a little wine, have some good food, and to just simply get acquainted as members of God's family. I'll be saying more about that in my sermon. How many of you attended the 8 o'clock this morning? Okay, so for those of you who didn't, I'm not going to repeat what I said there, but build on it a bit as a review. And for those of you who will be at the 10 o'clock, please raise your hand. This will be a preview. As Lee mentioned, probably one of the most profound experiences, if not the most profound experience for me in my ministry. This is my 39th year as an ordained minister of the church, and my 30th year as a bishop of the church, was the call to South Dakota to be the 8th bishop there. And profound in that my first 8 years as a priest was being a full-time member of the faculty of the School of Theology of the University of the South, and also teaching in the undergraduate department as well a bit, and serving that kind of ministry, an educational ministry, in preparing persons for ordination. That was the primary purpose of seminaries in those days. And then in the midst of all of that, came a call to at least entertain the notion of becoming a bishop in the church, something that I really hadn't planned on, but came unexpected, and something that has profoundly changed my life. Our life, actually. My wife, Liz, is here. Liz, stand up so everybody can see you. A little background. We had 3 very young children in 1983, and Liz was teaching school, math, and art at a little local prep school in Sewanee, St. Andrew's School. I had just been granted tenure and was looking forward to a long time as a scholar and academic and settling in. We built a house in Sewanee that Liz designed, and we were just getting ready to settle down after all of those years of graduate study, after seminary and so forth. And had started this new position and had worked in it several years. And then a seminary student of mine, a bit older, came to me one day while I was sitting in my office, and he said, Father Anderson, I want to tell you about something that happened in South Dakota. And I said, okay, Al, what was that? And he said, we tried to elect a bishop, and we were in Huron, South Dakota. Anybody been to South Dakota here? You know the area? It was February. We went to 30-some, I think it was 32 ballots. It started snowing very hard, and someone stood up and said, the Spirit is not moving, let's go home. And so they did, and I said, well, Al, that's very interesting. Why are you telling me this? And he said, well, in your lectures, and I taught theology at the University of the South, and my particular focus was theological anthropology, which is a fancy name for doctrine of humanity, which is a fancy name for talking about incarnation, which we'll be talking about a good bit the next 5 weeks. But he said, you know, you're always talking about persons in different cultures and how that binds us together in terms of our common humanity and so forth. So he said, why don't you put your mouth where your teaching is? And I said, well, what do you mean, Al? He said, well, we have this opening in South Dakota, and I think you ought to come up there and be our bishop. And I said, number one, too young. Number two, haven't had that much experience. And number three, thank you very much. I like my lifestyle right now. It's great. So, long story short, along with 11 other persons who were being considered, went to South Dakota with Al, first of all, to sort of test it out. And I said, I want to go at the worst time of the year. He said, well, let's go up the beginning of March. I said, I'd like to experience the diocese at that time. So we went up, and Al had a pickup truck, and he said, I want to show you the diocese and show you the state. The Diocese of South Dakota actually precedes statehood. It's all of South Dakota plus a little bit of North Dakota, Minnesota, and Nebraska, when it was a missionary district originally. So we went up and we drove around the state. And I shall never forget getting out. It was cold. When we arrived at West River, the diocese is divided by 2 cultures and 2 time zones. In the east, everyone is a farmer. In the west, everybody's a cowboy or cowgirl. And as we crossed the Missouri River into the west, I just felt God's presence. As we traveled from the river to what are called, unfortunately, the Badlands, because they're not. And I looked out and saw Pahasapa, the Black Hills. I knew that I had found my spiritual home, the sacredness of that land. And so I was deeply touched, but knew also that being too young and inexperienced, and not a person of South Dakota, being a native Californian, I knew that I would not be elected bishop given all the wonderful persons who were being nominated and so forth. So I returned home and said to Liz and the children, not to worry, this is not going to happen, but I truly love this land and want to find an excuse to go spend some time there. Well, the Lord heard my prayer, even though it was not articulated as a prayer, and was elected as the 8th Bishop of South Dakota. And we journeyed forth from the South and from an academic community to that wonderful place called Dakota, or Lakota, or Nakota, which translates as allies or friends in the Lakota language. And spent 9.5 wonderful years there as a member of that extended family. Which brings me to what I would like to share with you this morning. Lent, and the season of Lent, is a time that we are called upon to reflect. If you stop and think about human experience and the experience of the church as such, there are two primary modes of being. Two primary modes of being. The first tends to characterize the first half of our life, according to depth psychologist C.G. Jung. It's an active mode. It's a mode that we become educated, we engage the world in very important ways, we find a vocation, we answer a calling, vocare, and we strive. We do those things that are characteristic of first half of life, in terms of family, in terms of community, in terms of church. It's an active mode of existence. And then, for many, not necessarily all persons, there comes a point in our life that we find a need to reflect on all of that activity, to try to make sense of what our lives have been and should continue to be. A period to complement this active mode in a reflective mode, to take stock, to look inward, not just in terms of our individual being, but to look inward in terms of our involvement with community, the communities in which we live, and also the covenant community that we call the church. Given all of the activity, given all of the extroversion that's required in that first half of life, what is God calling us to as a community first and as individuals second? And Lent is a time, a season in the church when we are invited, following the example of our Hebrew brothers and sisters, to a time of prayer, a time of almsgiving, a time of study, and to look and to think about not only where we have been, but where we are going. A couple of weeks ago, I was in San Francisco at a vibrant parish there, and they're in the midst of transition. And they asked me to come and just to help with their search process, and they developed a very beautiful parish profile and a description of what they wanted in a priest as they anticipated new leadership. And all the things that they wanted, I said, I'm not sure that Jesus could live up to this kind of expectation, but it was a wonderful experience in terms of their mission statement and also in terms of their profile and who they are today. So we spent the better part of Saturday meeting with the search committee and then met with the vestry, and they said, do you have any observations with regard to what we want and where we're going? And I said, well, it's a beautiful profile, it's a nice description, and I'm sure you're going to attract some wonderful people. They said, what's missing? And I said, what's your vision for the church? It was a beautiful mission statement, to love, serve Jesus, and to make Jesus known. Succinct, clear. But I said, how does that work itself out in terms of what God is calling you to, given this time for reflection, as you anticipate new leadership to help you as a covenant community move forward? And so we have since talked a bit about that, and they're in the process of developing a vision for the parish based on the vision that comes from the diocese as well. I share this with you because many times we see Lent as a time to reflect on the present, especially in terms of today's lessons, as far as how we are tempted, the sin that divides us one from another, the call to repentance, and that tends to be focused a good bit on the present and the past. But I would invite your attention to perhaps a different way of thinking about Lent, and that's to think about what is God calling you to as St. John's Church, first of all, and then individually members of it during this Lenten season. Through prayer, through openness, through reflection, through the virtue of generosity, almsgiving. And where is that going? When I first arrived in South Dakota, as I mentioned in my sermon this morning, and I'll mention again briefly, I had the good sense as a very young bishop to seek help, primarily as a result of my inexperience. I had a lot of experience in terms of scholarship and all of that, but not much in terms of being a bishop or what that was like, or what South Dakota was like, or what that culture was like, given the fact that, again, as I mentioned in my sermon, of 100 and some odd churches there. 70 are on the reservations of the Great Sioux Nation. And I didn't know that culture other than having read about it and quoting it in lectures and so forth in class, but I didn't have a first-hand knowledge of it. And so I asked two persons to mentor me, and I'll talk more about that in my sermon in a bit, but one sage bit of advice that I received from one of those mentors, Father Noah Broken Leg, was he said, "Bishop, you come among us as a teacher and a leader, and that's why we've given you this lofty name of Wambli Tokehea, which means eagle, the first of which," interesting translation, which is a very spiritual bird. And I said, well, how do I do that, Father Noah? And he said, first of all, go on a vision quest. I said, what's a vision quest? And he said, well, I will help you and I will lead you and I will be with you up to a point. And we think that would be something that would help not only you, but help us as a diocese. And so Father Noah said it first begins with a sweat. And so we went to the sweat lodge. And he said, this is a rite of purification to get yourself clean and to get all of that southern sweat out of you from Sewanee, so you can come here and dry out a little bit in the high plains. He was kidding, but we went up to a place called Bear Butte, which is just outside of Sturgis, South Dakota. Any of you know Sturgis, South Dakota? Any bikers here riding motorcycles? Sturgis, South Dakota is home of one of the, I think, largest motorcycle rallies in the United States. When I first arrived there, Bishop, they do this in August every year, and it lasts about 2 weeks. And this little town of Sturgis, population of about 8,000, becomes home to, at that time, 50,000 bikers from all over. The number has now increased to close to 500,000 over 2 weeks. And they come and they ride all over the state and all over the hills. And the population of South Dakota is just a little better than 700,000. So all of a sudden to have this infusion of 500,000 is very interesting. But just outside of Sturgis, South Dakota, there's this beautiful butte called Bear Butte. And it has a commanding view of the Black Hills, a commanding view of land to the east and south to include the Badlands. It's a sacred place. And so after the sweat, Noah said, so we must go to the top of Bear Butte, and there I'm going to leave you for a few days for a vision quest. So we got there, and he sat me down with a gallon of water and said, and then drew a circle, a large circle around me with 4 points, cruciform, if you will, a circle at the center of which was this cross. And he said, so I want you to sit here and pray, and here's a Lakota prayer book, so you can begin to learn the language, and the best way to learn a language is to sing it and to pray it. And he said, I'll be back in 3 days to pick you up, and then you can tell me what you've learned. I thought, well, this is an interesting way to begin a ministry. Shouldn't I be meeting with the diocesan council and the standing committee and getting around to all the parishes because I was young and energetic? And he said, yeah, in time, but why don't you first of all understand who we are by understanding something about the land, because that's our primary identity. We are a people of the land. And if you would know us, you must know something of the land, because that's where God speaks to us. That's where God dwells. Not up in the heavens so much as in the earth. I thought, boy, that's great incarnational talk, Noah. And he said, we don't talk much about doctrines like that. Our theology is pretty concrete, grounded in the earth itself. And he said, and then when I come back to pick you up, I'll teach you about how to pray. So I remained there. And it was in the summer, and it was spectacularly beautiful. The quietness, the still, small voice of God speaking, the stars, the beauty of the surrounding, the commanding view. And I said that experience that I'd had earlier of saying, God walks here. God is here. Pahasapa, which is the location for all the Lakota creation stories, the Black Hills. I could feel that. Feel it deep, not within my mind so much, but within my soul. And I knew that I had not only been adopted in terms of the giving of a name, but I'd been adopted by the land itself. I felt it one day. And after that period of time, Noah did come back and brought with him some food. And he said, what did you learn? What sort of vision did you have? And I said, no, I have to tell you that I didn't have the direct line from God calling me up and saying, here are 10 things I'd like you to do. I just had this sense of peace and tranquility and being at one with this place and the sacredness of this place. And he said, as a result of that, what is God calling you to be and to do? And I said, I think it has to do with ministry of reconciliation, obviously, but reconciliation between peoples and also reconciliation with the land. At that time, you may recall, during the early 80s, in the late 70s, there was a movement called AIM, the American Indian Movement, with some tragic consequences in some of the border towns, especially in South Dakota, where there was manifest institutional racism, a lot of violence. And I said, I think it has something to do with that. And he nodded. And I said, I think one of the ways perhaps that God spoke to me in terms of just being present in this beautiful spot is to see how, despite our differences, what we have in terms is a common mother. And the land can help us in terms of that reconciliation. And he nodded again. And he said, now, Bishop, it's time to go down and to make that incarnate in your ministry, to lead us and to be led by God's Spirit. When we arrived at the Rosebud Reservation, he took me out to another beautiful spot and said, this is how we pray. And again, in the midst of the circle, and I was delighted to see your labyrinth, by the way. That sense of wholeness, that sense of the circle in terms of our common life together. And he taught me to pray in the 4 directions, using the 4 virtues, which we'll be talking about. This is a teaser for Wednesday night, by the way. The 4 virtues, the 4 directions, the 4 colors, and he taught me to do that in Lakota, and then he translated for me in English what those prayers were about. And I've used those prayers and used that symbol, which is on my crozier, and I'll bring that at some point. I was given an eagle feather only with permission of a federal judge, because non-Indians can't have those. And it's on a porcupine, what would appear to be a mandala, which is a sacred hoop with a cruciform thing at the center. And I like to use that when I pray. And so I'll bring that down some Wednesday. And we'll take a look at that and learn how to pray a bit. Maybe not in Lakota per se, but at least the essence of those prayers. Noah and my other mentor also introduced me then to the people. And the profound realization I had was that apart from the land, one's identity is diminished. Now that was particular to the land of South Dakota, but it also applies to all of us. And one of the problems we have in our culture is that much of our life is characterized by dislocation. How many of you were born and reared in Kirkland? Raise your hand. Take a look around. Well, let's try a little broader. How about the state of Washington? That's a little better, maybe a quarter. How many of you have moved in the course of your lifetime at least once? Keep your hands up. Twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. You get the idea. We tend to be a very mobile society, don't we? And as a result of that, we are sometimes not only alienated from our products, as some persons have said, that which we produce, but sometimes we are alienated from our sense of place and sacred space. All of God's creation is sacred, and yet we from time to time set aside those places like this church, sanctuary. Are the doors here red? I forgot to. No. That's typical Episcopal churches, though, isn't it? Because it's a sign of sanctuary. We have these wonderful places that we consecrate, make holy, that we can come and be reminded of our identity with one another in our connection to the land. And that has to do with incarnation, relationship with one another, which I'll say more about in a few moments. But coming back full circle to what I wanted to suggest to you as we begin this Lenten series and as we begin our sojourn for these next several weeks, is to concentrate not only on the present and the past in terms of our need to repent and to pray and to look inward and to move from an active perhaps to a receptive mode, but also to think about that as a community of faith first, and then individually second. When we think about Lent, it's often, well, I'm going to give this up, or I'm going to do this. These individual disciplines that form our life together, right? And while that's important, what I hope to engage you in and with over the course of the next several weeks is how we do that as a community. How we do that together in discerning what we need to reflect on here at St. John's as a part of this wonderful diocese, and the vision that the bishop has for this diocese, which you probably well know by now, which is a threefold vision. The first having to do with congregational development, developing congregations to grow and to thrive in the Spirit. And second, as a part of that, and importantly and very specifically, to look at persons under age 35 and asking them to be a part of the covenant community, a part of the family, and engaging them. And then third, and one that gives me such hope and is the reason I wanted to work with Bishop Rickle, is his vision for stewardship of creation itself, which is grounded in incarnation. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So I hope that's enough of a teaser to get you interested in coming on Wednesday nights. And I'd like to engage you as theologians in terms of the original meaning of that term. We tend to think of theologians as very academic persons who do reflection in a scholarly way in seminaries and universities, studying texts and in church history and looking at particular liturgical rites and so forth. But you know, first and foremost, theologians, as the word suggests, they're two words, logos and theos, are persons who talk to God in prayer and then talk about God in terms of reflecting on our experience of God. And that's what Holy Scripture is. It's a reflection on our experience with God, beginning with Genesis, not to be taken literally, but continuing up through that difficult book, which never should have made the canonical cut, called Revelation. And if you have a profound understanding of the book of Revelation, please educate me. I've struggled with it for 40 years at least, and at any rate. So the invitation is then to come together on these evenings, and in the course of this Lenten journey, obviously on Sundays, and to move from that mode of a lot of activity to that peace of God, that quietness which surpasses all understanding, and that all of us so desperately need. And a life that's filled with so much noise and activity and confusion. And to move perhaps from to incorporate the traditional understandings of Lent, but also to think about that as a community, the church, and to think about what God is calling us to in terms of the future. I'll conclude with a little comment, a little exegesis on today's lessons. It's a strange chronology. Last Sunday, we had the Transfiguration, right? Hearkening back to Elijah and fulfillment of prophecy, and Moses and fulfillment of the law, which, by the way, is a bad translation. Law should really be thought of as teaching. And Jesus comes fulfilling both of those, hence the vision, etc., etc. Jesus goes up to the mountain not alone, but he picks his 3 favorite disciples, community from the very beginning of his ministry. Very beginning. And they go to that mountaintop, and Jesus is transfigured, and you know the reaction of the 3. Peter wants to concretize it by building something, and the other 2 are sort of baffled. And then we jump to today, where after his baptism, a communal cleansing, not too unlike a sweat lodge sort of thing, Jesus is driven into the wilderness for 40 days. Moses, Elijah, wilderness wandering. And in addition to being tempted, is led by God to a vision of what as God's Son is called to do. That comes before the Transfiguration. And everything that follows the temptations in the desert leads to that Transfiguration. So let us during this season not only recall the past, think about it, but envision the future as well. See you in church.